Thank you everybody who has joined us from the different sections of the University of Oxford, and if there are people chatting with us or involved in this fruitful discussion with us about urban waste, animals and humans who need to share living spaces. It is interesting for us to talk about interdisciplinarity, given that in seemingly our working conditions, Gregor and I were not supposed to collaborate because he deals with zooarchaeological samples and evolution of various domesticated species. I, on the other hand, work on commensals in urban systems who take advantage of human mediated food subsidies. So it was at Royal Veterinary College when Gregor and I met, and we found that in discussions around these food subsidies, which humans have been providing to multiple animal species, and how they became eventually human food, we have common interests about which I'm going to illustrate. Talking about Gregor's research profile, he illustrates using genomic methods or modern genomic technologies, how, and his research primarily focuses on evolution of dogs, chickens, pigs, and similar kind of domesticates with which we share our living spaces. If we go through the theory, then there are three major pathways for animal domestication. They're called prey pathway in the sense that we kind of predated certain species and eventually we could do a very focused breeding of those specific animals which became our prey. The second one, which is quite famous and which is quite well known, is the Commensal Pathway, in the sense that humans started living in the form of colonies when we had our own living systems, or from Neolithic age onwards, when we started producing waste and different food items on which animals would take advantage. So we directed domestication through Commensal Pathway in those ways. The third one is called directed pathway, which means that we started to direct the specific, or we started a directed pathway of how and when and which specific individuals were supposed to be bred to obtain the desired results in our domesticates. Although researchers from Gregor's fraternity who deal with genomics data talk a lot from zooarchaeological samples, quite often we have to be content, or we of course do not have a lot of say in terms of what animals were doing in those times. We interpret from zooarchaeological remains, apart from genomics data, whatever archaeological samples support, we tend to understand the conditions back then. But we also understand that things like behavior, or how behavior expresses itself in populations, it takes several hundreds of thousands of years for certain behaviors to get instilled in a population. And by that virtue, both of us thought that we can come together along with other colleagues whose names you can see on the screen now. And considering that our research is based on people, animal, and waste systems, we call ourselves PAWS-Web group. It's quite an extensive group with close to 20 experts who are from 6 different countries. And there are people out here who are not only scientists or researchers from various disciplines, we also have stakeholders who are administrators who need to deal with the idea of waste, and who owns the waste, and where do these animals which depend on waste need to be treated when we gentrify our living systems. Over the next 30 minutes, I will be discussing how we are going to tackle the big problem of production and consumption of livestock in developing economies, considering the reach of genetic engineering and other artifacts. This paper, which came in BNS recently, has like illustrated the biomass distribution on Earth. Of interest for us is this small triangle, which denotes the animal biomass. It's quite predictably like capitalized by the polygon represented by orthopods. The GTC here is a unit of like metric tons of carbon sequestered by a particular taxa. Interesting aspect for us here is the small triangle of wild birds and wild mammals. While we are so concerned about humanistic impacts on non-human species, these biomass distributions hold importance when these polygons, large polygons of zero point 0.1 GTC and zero point 0.0 GTC for livestock and humans respectively are creating havoc on non-human systems. To illustrate it through an example and something which has missed this kind of global analysis is how much of biomass is captured in the human waste which is produced from our kitchens. For a cursory estimate from one of the largest landfills in Asia, this is Ghazipur landfill in Delhi, about 40% of about 500 truckload of garbage which is offloaded here is like composed of biodegradable material, which is consumed not only by kites, but dogs, even like poor people feed their livestock on these garbage heaps. So in context of domestication discussion, on which I just reflected, this would be the typical example of Commensal Pathway of how we might still be impacting hundreds and thousands of species due to when and where edible biomass is available for animals to capitalize upon. This scenario of thousands of kites, which you can see on the screen, is recent, and these landfills used to be occupied by vultures in South Asia just 20, 30 years ago. So our research focus also takes into consideration the impacts humans have had on non-human systems, and with the removal of vultures due to the usage of diclofenac, which is a veterinary drug, and when these vultures used to feed on carcasses which has diclofenac in them, they used to suffer with gout, and we kind of exterminated about 97% of vulture population in India because of livestock rearing practices using diclofenac. To illustrate these aspects from observational and experimental approaches on ecology and behavior, in Delhi, we have a system of about 32 sampling units, each measuring 1 square kilometer, and they are distributed in stratified random design to cover all aspects of urbanization, which would include cultural practices, which would also include urban green cover, built up spaces, the history of how in which section of the city came into being, etc. Considering the discussion on vulture, it is important for us to illustrate how the demand for animal protein, which increased through the Green Revolution and White Revolution in South Asia, which essentially mean that we brought a lot of genetic engineering technology to fortify our crops, and we used a lot of fertilizers and insecticides to increase the yield, which like signaled the Green Revolution. In case of White Revolution, it was again the increase in the milk yield of our livestock. And South Asia currently holds the largest population of livestock. And it is interesting for us to be losing vultures in these times because for hundreds of years, vultures were involved in the business of raising livestock. So there were specific communities called chamars. Of course, these have their own history of like casteism and other negative practices associated with deskinning of cattle and to utilize the skin or hide to make like leather items. But in every village or township, there used to be a particular area where people used to leave these carcasses out in open. Suddenly in 20, 30 years, with the loss of vultures, we hardly have like disposal mechanism for these carcasses. They're often either buried in limited spaces in case if they're available, but mostly they're left in outside for other scavengers to capitalize upon. Considering the questions around domestication, most of the like well-known scholars from in the league of like Gregor Larson, they are discussing the current connotations of domestication which have gone unnoticed. So while they take cognizance of the samples or zooarchaeological samples, and a lot of research is going on in that regard, these facilities of changing interactions with one commensal and another commensal taking its place has not been well appreciated, and which is what we are solving. Another aspect of focus of Gregor's and my own research is the dominance of chicken in every pot, which is a proverbial like signal, which means that prosperity like brings in a lot of like non-vegetarian diet in people's plates. For instance, in India, like people in general outside India, they consider that most of the Indians are vegetarians, but a recent survey pointed out that more than 80% of Indians are non-vegetarians. We are not functional non-veg item eaters because of the pocket size, but of late in areas like Delhi, where national per capita income, where the per capita income is thrice the national average, you have a lot of people consuming non-vegetarian products. It is important to understand how even chicken, which is the broiler chicken size, evolved in last 50 years, which has increased about 3 times. And simultaneously, surveys also inform that we have reduced the biomass of wild birds by 3 times in the same sense. So it will be interesting for us to stay as a group on the PAWS-Web umbrella and discuss how these wild gene pools are facing homogeneity from various practices, which not only run in large farms, but a lot of like poultry production happens in South Asia or similar areas in people's backyard. An interesting aspect which I just like discussed in the beginning of this presentation was the waste biomass. And we recently concluded a small cursory study at the largest poultry market in Asia, which is just beside the Gazipur landfill on the eastern border of Delhi. So out there, close to 100,000 chickens are slaughtered on a daily basis. And from each chicken, we generate close to 200 grams of slaughter waste. An annual estimate says that it weighs somewhere about like 7.3 cross 10 raised to the power 5 kilograms per year. And the pictures which you just saw a few slides ago, this one, sorry, is the large flock, or shall I say swarm of like kites which move from Central Asia to South Asia to overwinter. So this large amount of chicken waste which is available for kites to feed on attracts them and kind of pushes them or kind of supports a population of about 10,000 kites on the largest landfill. And it is interesting for us to note that even 10,000 kites eating this chicken poultry waste remain only removes about 30% of the waste, which is produced by the amount of chicken which people in Delhi are eating. Interesting aspect to note from here on would be what happens when these black kites, which are migratory in nature, which are called black-eared kites, which are different from the resident breeding kites in South Asia, when they go back after March and April. For about 6 months, kites, about 1,000 kites are seen on this large dump, and which essentially means that they are only tending to less than 1% of this huge biomass produced because of poultry slaughter. We got to know about these aspects by putting transmitters on black kites, and such kind of technologies, which are like relatively cheaper these days and quite accessible for people in developing countries. We can track their movements from Delhi's landfill to like various parts in Central Asia. Up on your screen is the depiction of onward and return journeys of about 20 kites. We have been tagging since 2014. We intend to tag more to understand and illustrate the ideas of why they take certain pathways to enter and why this large physical space from which these 20 kites have been coming and going back to Central Asia is congregated in just 4,500 square kilometer in and around Delhi. So with the available data, we can clearly say that it is largely because of the amount of poultry waste and other meat-based waste available for these kites to feed on. And this is another pathway through which black kites from the eastern part of Mongolia enter the Indian subcontinent. This is also from the same paper if people wish to dig deeper into the details. And we illustrated major pathways for Central Asian flyway. And unfortunately for this interesting flyway, which is used by billions of birds to move from Central Asia to South Asia and related parts, we have very poor information. It gets interesting to talk about the biomass of chicken, migration of kites, the two pathways of them, major migratory movements I just discussed, in relation to where people have this showcase the distribution of genetic lines of the bird flu virus. The triangles and their colors represent various clades, and the details can be found out from Zoo and colleagues' research paper and scientific reports. And lesser number of triangles in South Asia does not mean that we have lesser threats. It's just that we have not been sampling the waterfowl, which bring a lot of viruses or avian flu viruses along with them when they migrate. For birds like kites, which take advantage on the poultry fill, which is available in South Asia, and also they are quite capable to predate on waterfowl. These scenarios or modern scenarios perpetuated by urbanization hold importance because where they kind of co-occur because of limited areas where thousands of these kites and waterfowl can coexist. And I just discussed that a lot of poultry rearing in South Asia happens in the backyards of people, which which is a classic case or for potential exchange in between waterfowl, which is coming as migratory stock from Central Asia, and where kites, waterfowl, and backyard poultry can interact. The gray shade on this slide represents the existing density of where poultry or broiler chicken is raised. And it is interesting to note that next 98% of increase in poultry production would happen in this zone. So it is important for us to come together as a PAWS-Web unit and take forward what I have just illustrated in about 8 to 9 years of research in Delhi, which was a small study based on understanding the habitation and behavior of resident breeding black kites. So it was interesting for us to note that Muslim meat tossing practice during the prayer hours and the patches of vegetation associated with mosques where such kind of meat tossing practice happens, use or which primarily governed or mediated where these black kites would like to build their nest. Not only this, such kind of associations also perpetuated the population density and its variation across the geography of the city. So kites preferred or over exploited these large trees to build nests in case you have a kind of a clear spatial signature of people from Muslim community tossing meat to them on a daily basis. And kites grab these meat chunks, and our study, which has still not been published, informs that the breeding kite's diet is composed of 90% of the breeding kite's diet is composed of the meat chunks which are tossed ritually in older sections of Delhi. Details can be studied from this article which came out in 2019. So with this background, I will just step ahead and give a larger collective view for which PAWS-Web was constituted with generous funding support from IndOx, where Gregor, Ben Sheldon from Oxford Zoology, and we collaborated to form a network of colleagues. When I flip these images, you will be able to notice certain changes. I will flip it back and forth again for you to appreciate these changes. And you can very well see that with progressive urbanization or gentrification of urban systems, and which is quite characteristic of of South Asian or similar kind of developing nations that we have like heterogeneous patches wherein there is a lot of field in few areas. Over the time, this field gets removed. People have like better amenities around them, and like the built-up area increases, it reduces the green cover. So such kind of practices, apart from like ritual practices of feeding animals, is a characteristic aspect of South Asia. And my past research informed that such kind of philanthropic practice of feeding animals in Delhi's street has links with the aggressive responses from animal breeders. So again, linking it with the history of domestication of animals, it is interesting to note that, of course, through prey pathway, commensal pathway, or directed like breeding pathways, we have like chosen species which were like less aggressive towards humans. But what about situations in South Asia or similar areas in African nations or South America, for instance? Like we might be perpetuating various species or like various populations wherein aggressive like responses are tolerated because of religious or like, ritual behavior. I have a funny connotation to share, specifically when I shift from the discussion of chickens and kites to dogs, which are a characteristic like signature in the streets of Delhi, and likewise areas in South Asia, also in many African nations. Sorry, I'm unsure like how many of us have seen this movie, but Joker, who was the antagonist in the movie Dark Knight, said to the protagonist Batman that, do I really look like a guy with a plan? So he was talking about himself in terms of what the atrocities he brought upon the Gotham City. He said, like, you know what? I'm like a dog chasing cars, and I would not know what to do one if I caught it. You know what? I just do things. So for somebody like me who is a trained behavioral ecologist, of course, this does not hold true. Perhaps Mr. Joker did not know and has not walked in the streets of South Asia to understand that chasing cars has a clear like association in terms of that particular car or tire of a car having a spray mark of a dog, sorry, of another dog. And people also like have like these social hypotheses are quite common in the streets of Delhi, where people say that because that particular dog might have been like run over in its past life or like yesteryears, they tend to chase those cars in a similar fashion. An interesting aspect which is quite unique to like dogs, cars, people in Delhi, and which is not quite frequent in like less urbanized spaces of South Asia, is dogs claiming the rooftop of vehicles. Of course, like such kind of behavior is not like possible if people were not tolerant of dogs which take claim of their rooftops, often like disfiguring the rooftops in the process. So if I'm supposed to like interpret these scenarios like a behavioral ecologist would do, then like suddenly these kind of urbanization signatures which are associated with vehicles have created a lot of noise for the lives of dogs. Dogs, as you know, like us, use three basic senses: the auditory cues, the olfactory cues, and the visual cues to like get on with their lives. They, unfortunately for dogs, the, the increase in the number of cars in the streets of Delhi has brought a lot of olfactory noise. I guess I'm unsure if like there are people in Oxford who have not visited South Asia, but if you have visited, I guess this kind of like scenarios of dogs urinating on the car tires is quite common for us to notice. It is interesting for us also to like differentiate in between how this practice of like spray marking differs in between males and female. So bitches tend to squat down and largely mark on the ground surface horizontally, whereas males tend to raise their legs as much as they can. And this has been like studied by few colleagues who say that the level at which this spray reaches designates the sexual selection by the female, because then she can make out which dog had a larger size. So in case of dog worlds, these olfactory signatures are like proper identity cards or passports, which they utilize to enter into, or which they utilize to signal their territory sizes, or like what are the territories which are being guarded by a particular male. Because these like vehicles are moving, so it is very less likely for like this surface of like tires to carry the female signatures, because that comes in contact with the soil quite frequently. And in such scenario, it has allowed our research group to question how are we changing the life worlds of dogs in the streets of Delhi, depending upon which urban composition they belong. I've tried to simplify it for us into four scenarios. Situation one, where we have like good lights and many vehicles which carry the spray mark. Situation two, where we have a lot of light, but we do not have vehicles. Situation three, which has like poor lighting, which is quite characteristic for about 70 to 80% of Delhi, but there are still a lot of vehicles parked on the side of the roads. Situation four would be for like small outskirts or like few like near natural areas, or like parks in Delhi where, or national parks or sanctuaries in Delhi where we have like few to no vehicles and like of course bad lighting. So because the hypothesis should go like this, that if you have like three senses which are being utilized by dogs to carry on their day-to-day activities, if there is a lot of noise with olfactory signal, you would eventually switch it. If you were a dog, you would switch to other potential signals to ascertain the situation of if you have a competitor in your system. So uh, in order to kind of give an analogical view of how it might be affecting the dog worlds, it is similar to like those ghost movies which showcase that ghosts are doing something for like human beings in particular movie scenes. People can see the actions of ghosts, that things start to fall. You suddenly see that the chair is rocking, but you can't see who is doing it. In a similar area, if the dog is supposed to like decide its territoriality on the basis of spray marks on which these vehicles are carrying by moving from one territory to another territory, you will have a dog which is supposed to respond to a ghost enemy for which the physical presence is not there. So in such situations, when we have a lot of olfactory noise, dogs are supposed to like rely more on like like visual signals and auditory signals. And because of this, I formed several hypotheses here on the basis of discussions with our colleagues. And we thought that in situations of bad light, where we have like many vehicles carrying olfactory signals, you will have more aggressive dogs. And because dogs would like to invest into aggressive decisions, if there is like some light available for them to like stay underneath, it will like lightly buffer the competitive struggles they would have with their conspecifics. And we are like still like ongoing with this research on dogs in our system. And we believe that dogs which tend to bite people during the dark hours, it's largely because this whole scenario, or scenario number three or scenario number two, when you have like situations of like a lot of vehicles carrying like dog sprays, when people move in such areas, they are perceived as like potential competitors, and dogs tend to attack them in like particular breeding areas. Illustrating this figuratively in the form of which a graph would be on x-axis in case if you divide. So I'm like putting the hypothesis on terms of how the number of vehicles can interact with the night light with the behavior of where the dogs would like to be. And for that, we wanted to test over the last 1 month, we wanted to test if dogs will prefer well lit areas when there are a higher number of vehicles. So for that, we also chose areas which had like comparable amount of like human food subsidies accessible for dogs. And you can very clearly see, based on the chi-square estimates, that dogs significantly preferred well-lit areas in case it was available for them. And in case of like absence of vehicles, this difference was not that significant. Another hypothesis for which we are collecting data is built or has a prediction that for similar levels of access to food subsidies, dog in poor lit areas will show higher aggression when large number of vehicles are parked on the sides of the roads, which means there would be a lot of olfactory noise for these dogs. So in such situations, we expect like our data to like illustrate these distinctions of how dog worlds are being impacted by urbanization, and which is a dynamic component of domestication. Talking about how IndOx supported grant allowed us to move from these kind of small questions to plan big and discuss the impact of food subsidies, urban infrastructure, road structures on how various animals, commensals like dogs, macaques, and livestock share spaces with us, holds importance in terms of what they call as home in shared living spaces. For instance, a lot of like colonies in Delhi are being gentrified. People are being temporarily moved from one area to another. For instance, the area where I'm presently talking from, Kirtinagar, it had a slum, and 20,000 people were moved from here in 2017 December, and they were shifted 6 kilometers apart, but nobody bothered about the commensals like dogs, rats, and other commensals which shared like life spaces with people. So by understanding their dispersal patterns, dial cycles, and how the seasonality impacts their behavior while these populations are constituted by breeding and non-breeding individuals. Our research group, which is PAWS-Web, would focus on how diseases are perpetuated, diseases like rabies, and which are spread primarily by dog bites and monkey bites. So it has resulted into like funding support from Wellcome Trust for next 5 years. And of course, what I showed you a few slides away is a simplified version of what we are supposed to tackle over the primary, secondary, and tertiary roads of Delhi. So we are going to use a lot of trail cameras and put them strategically to understand how the animal usage of garbage and ritual feeding varies. We are like supported by people who are like experts in cognitive behavior to understand how these animals can predict like the likelihood of where they can find a lot of human food subsidies. And such type of research, which is going to like designate the habitat suitability of various streets in cities like Delhi, which roughly means 52% geographical space on Earth, we would be able to discuss the impact of Anthropocene on behavior and physiology of various commensals who share our life spaces. So IndOx grant also allowed us to like build new collars to monitor the movement of dogs and macaques. We are still to deploy these collars in as much numbers as we would have want to, because a lot of our preparations were impacted by COVID. But in next 2-3 months, we will get these results with us, and I'm happy to share and illustrate how like movement behaviors, which we will understand through these long range collars, which are quite cheap, and like a collar costs about like 300 pounds. And by understanding the movement in response to like anthropogenic signatures of where we have put food into the system, would allow us to understand its impact of demographic parameters for these commensals in various parts of the city, as animals call various sections of the city as their habitats. I would like to summarize here, according to this slide, that the result of our next 5 years of research would see a reduction in the human-animal conflict, which contributes to zoonotic incidences, For instance, while like World Health Organization envisions the removal of rabies from human-dominated areas, and unless we understand how the rabies virus subsists in dogs, macaques, and other mammals or warm-blooded animals, we will not be able to like achieve those targets. Like I just like started this discussion around the ongoing process of domestication with which the developing world had still to come and settle around. We still have to like decide about the practices of like putting food for animals either deliberately in the form of ritual practices or through like how these animals respond to a lot of waste into our system. We will be able to answer like some components of the big question of like, can we have like animal supported scavenging services, which is quite characteristic for developing world, and like can we share living spaces with these commensals which continue to respond to human generated food subsidies. With this, I will also like focus on the chance which such kind of like generous grants from IndOx allowed us to like do like workshops for school kids, people who are dwelling in shanties and slums in India, and the results have been fantastic. This is a typical way of how we do this research in the streets of Delhi, and we look forward to like interacting with you guys more. My presentation here. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm certainly happy to begin a discussion in hopes that perhaps people, having seen that really excellent presentation, are still contemplating everything they've just learned. So Nishant, firstly, thank you very much for that. That's what I love about this, is that it's thinking about sort of the modern ways in which everything is changing, which leads to much more of a dynamic thinking around this whole thing. And I just can't help but wonder, because we're thinking a lot about the terminology associated with domestication, and you mentioned the different pathways and things. And I'm just, from my own perspective, I'm pretty suspicious of the directed pathway. For me, it doesn't exist. And in fact, I'm even going further recently to wonder if we need the term, or is this just evolution and selection within an ecological framework? I mean, is it possible that we could be thinking about this completely outside of any domestic or domestication context, is the way that it's commonly framed?
So I would like definitely agree with you on this aspect, because in terms of like directed pathways at max, like, and even if I'm allowed to like comment, it will largely be like the scenario of how like we are breeding hens in like large farms, like, and we surely did not have like these kind of facilities thousands of years ago when we actually domesticated these species. So like somewhere like the interaction in between like prey pathways and commensal pathways and like directive interactions, which you just said, that like ecological like underpinnings of how these occur at multiple landscapes together, and like how frequently do they spread, again because of like those ecological situations which allow people to connect or at times even move from one area to another area, with domesticates when people like move possibly with dogs, because you recently published a paper about it.
Mm. And I would even go so far, like just using that terminology about we domesticated, that makes it sound very much like it was a top-down, goal-directed, intentional thing. And that what people do is you're using it as a transitive verb, right? The sort of the grammar where it's like you have the domesticator and the domesticatee, and people see an opportunity and go out and do things. And we just published a couple papers last week about chickens, which show that, or at least suggest strongly that you have a precursor to this whole interaction between people and chickens, and that's the arrival of dry rice agriculture into peninsular Southeast Asia, which sort of acts as a magnet, drawing birds out and getting them closer to a human niche, wherein once you reduce that physical proximity, now that there's different elements of selection and intensification that occur as a result of that, but you need something to drive it that isn't just people going and grabbing birds from a tree or something. And what I love about that is that what you have is that what we now call domestic animals are really just a byproduct of an accidental interaction that gets kickstarted through some means that nobody ever intended. And what you're showing through all of these other studies is how that's continuing, and how, multi-thousand years later, we are still changing environments in such a way that animals are having to change, or we are severely influencing the selection pressures and often the demography of a lot of these different species through not just biological evolution, but through this cultural evolution. The arrival of people who have different ways of interacting with the animals, and like throwing meat into the air is going to have a significant effect on. I mean, you said it was more than 95% of the total diet was coming from these activities, and it's those are the sorts of things that I think that we, by calling domestication something that is top down and directed, that it blinds you to the kinds of questions that you can ask. And what I really like about this research is that it's demonstrating very clearly that we're seeing this in real time in the present. So why wasn't this also the case 5,000, 10,000 years ago, when lots of these interactions were really just getting started? And surely there must have been components that were cultural. Surely there must have been other things that how they were interacting with these animals. And by insisting that it was just people going and grabbing something and putting it into a box and calling it domestic, it kind of precludes us from asking these questions. And that's why it's so much fun about it. So, and then also, of course, altering not just the birds in as they're present with people, as you're clearly with the photographs are just phenomenal. I mean, that black and white picture of all those vultures, where they're not just on the site, but if you look in the background, they're occupying the ledges, and even on the tops of every single square centimeter of space is covered with. It's just insane. And then having the ability to track them over long distance through telemetry and things. And so you're altering not just the physical space with people, but once they leave that at different times of the year, that all gets changed as well. And then that's probably going to have knock-on ramifications downstream to the kinds of other organisms that they're interacting with when they're not in the cities and not at the dump and everything else. And that, I just think that has the potential to really overturn a lot of the key assumptions that people who don't study this make about the nature of the human-animal interaction and relationship. And that's just outstanding.
I have nothing better to support it, but I'm unsure if you read this paper which came out recently in Tree, Trends in Ecology and Evolution. It's open on my screen now, and it questions what is domestication. And
this is
Michael D. Puruganan.
Yeah.
And if I'm supposed to critique this paper, then I very clearly see that in terms of him suggesting that did we domesticate ourselves, and he's just saying that of course we do not have genetic signatures of that kind, and the way we have reduced our facial structures, it can be achieved by other pathways as well. And of course we clearly have not domesticated ourselves for, again, that directed benefit and directed pathways which you just criticized. But when we talk of humans, of course a lot of different dynamics come around which can impact the trade-offs, also which can impact the payoffs in a different sense. So human beings are not like animals. We can plan hundreds of years ahead, and in that sense we bring a lot of social sciences and those dynamics up around. When we discuss this scenario of vultures having suffered a local decline in Delhi, and when we subject this question to people who do mid tossing, and we ask them what will you do in case kites go extinct? So they respond that according to the scriptures they read, they're supposed to feed the creations by the Almighty God. So if not kites, they will start feeding something else. So eventually it is, and they themselves do not realize that it is supporting 90% of breeding kites diet on an average in Delhi. So for such specific scenarios, anything about directed pathways it's a foolish argument, because people doing it and contributing to a very directed way in which these black kites respond not only to the resources but also to human beings. Black kites tend to attack humans because they lose their fear of humans, because they interact with them when they come and swoop down and take away the milk chunk. So in a similar way, if very capable kite pairs, and we have shown in as part of multiple publications that those habituated pairs can also attack human beings because they are safeguarding their nests from potential intruders. So in such scenarios, I guess Michael has of course missed the non-natural sciences or beyond natural sciences perspectives on animal domestication.
Right. And I would even go further and say that just asking the questions about whether humans have domesticated themselves completely is just for me, it's a dumb question, because I think that domestication is only something that takes place, and really what all you're describing is a specific evolutionary scenario for which we already have the terminology. But in this particular scenario, it's just humans and another animal versus two animals or two microbes or a plant and animal or whatever it is.
Yeah.
We have symbiosis and mutualism already. Why do we don't need the word domestication, except unless we want to specifically highlight cases of of mutualism between people and something else.
Yeah.
So you need two actors for anything even closely related for domestication to take place. So to talk about it in terms of ourselves is just, for me, it obliterates the meaningfulness of the term itself, and therefore puts you into this space where you're actually reifying a component of domestication, which I don't think exists, right? So it's just I don't know. Analogies are great in science and learning, and it's how we kind of explore the world. Is we take something and we apply it to something else, and that's great. My problem with it is that if we take something and apply it to something, thereby undermining what that initial thing was in the first place, then you end up obfuscating rather than clarifying, and then the whole exercise is just kind of full of BS. But that's just me. I've got strong opinions on this, but I'm not afraid to I'm not afraid to say them. So.
I would just iterate that it is another the idea of self-domestication again is something about top down. There was somebody regulating it from some institution or section of the society. I don't know.
Yeah. And if not self, I mean, that appears to be like that. If it's not self, it's guided or it's directed or it's something else. I mean, the other day I tried to find all the different ways in which people have appended domestication with some qualifier in the front of it with a hyphen. And I found 7 different things, including trans domestication and super domestication. I mean, none of these terms have any relevance whatsoever, because they're not even using the word domestication in a way which is remotely useful or helpful. And yet that's precisely because it's been ill-defined and people kind of have a gut instinct about it, that they're not afraid then to take whatever meaning they want from it and apply it to a different scenario. And now it's doubly irrelevant because it doesn't work in the original setting. It doesn't work in the applied setting, in which case, what are we even doing here? This is just silliness.
I guess if we can take a courageous step as collaborators and write about what we have been getting from the streets, not just from the dogs, but also people who feed dogs. And then there is another section in the same society, just few roads or blocks away, who would like you to help with get rid of dogs. So, and they tend to clash with each other. They use legal frameworks available to settle whether or not they would be allowed to continue feeding dogs in the streets of Delhi. So
yeah, but what we're talking about here is evolutionary ecology, right?
Yeah,
and that's what makes it super exciting, because once we can remove the whole domestic framework from this, we're talking about an organism that has already become very acclimated to a human niche, but now we're changing elements of that human niche and enforcing a slightly different selective pressure on this. I mean, it's vaguely related in an interesting way to different selective pressures imposed by changing cultural tastes. So if you go back 30 or 40 years in the US beef market, everybody was really into this concept of marbling, which really just means more fat. So when you look at the picture of the beef itself, the slab, it's got all this kind of white fat throughout. It's called a marbled beef, right? And then there was a real emphasis after a variety of people came, directives regarding diet were maybe not having a huge amount of meat fat in your diet is a good thing. And so everybody wanted lean meat from that point. And you can actually see shifts in the allele frequencies in highly selected lines of beef cattle where they are reducing marbling now. So at first everybody wants it, so they increase that, and then they don't want it anymore, so they decrease that. And you see the same thing with different color eggs as well, and what people culturally would prefer to have, what they want. You see it in cheeses, you see it in all kinds of things where there's a slightly shifting taste, and even dog breeds for that matter. And there was a news article today about how the vets were saying people shouldn't buy bulldogs until the breed has been shaped differently, which I just thought was an interesting use of that verb. But the idea here is that you have different selective pressures acting because you've got changing cultural norms and expectations and desires for things. But that is really, we don't need domestication for this. That's evolutionary ecology. And what's really cool about the stuff that you're doing is it's exploring it in ways that have not been seen in a real-time level with very different cultural settings than are generally considered within the realm of kind of, if not acceptable, then kind of thought about contexts. And you were providing lots of different animals, lots of different contexts, and it's just way, this is just outstanding. I just love it. I think it's great.
Glad you
But I
think
think we need to be careful with our terminology too, right?
Yeah,
We don't want to
yeah.
give the false impression that this is anything to do with something that was happening 5,000 years ago. In when we're thinking
No,
about the
no.
way that people popularly conceive of domestication. Instead, it's like, look, let's put this within an ecological evolutionary framework where we are talking about specific animals and specific people in specific contexts. The status of the animal is almost irrelevant. Does it matter if the kites are domestic or not? No. Does it matter if the dogs are feral or wild or anything? No, none of this matters. What matters is the shifting of the selection pressure and the knock-on effects of that. And then we can just dispense with all the trivialities and the noise and just focus on the signal, which I just think it's super great.
And yeah, like if like we continue to like provide these like selective pressures which like choose for directional selections, we might just have like a specific type of dogs in Delhi streets or no dogs perhaps like in 20-30 years. And that has happened with like most of the like Western societies, I guess. Like people have dogs in their homes, but they don't have them in the streets anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And if like somebody is supposed to interpret this without having this idea of what is going on in reality in terms of dogs versus humans and dogs and humans, it will be like badly interpreted as again a directed pathway that somebody exterminated dogs.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, I think this is great. I'm really looking forward to the kinds of, because it just seems like there's a huge open, the giant landscape of questions that you could start to address with this, and a whole range of different techniques and methodologies and with which you could do it. So I'm just excited about seeing where this all goes, because you're talking about like long distance flights with birds, you're talking about the dogs and all kinds of variety of different settings involving light and people and density and gentrification and the whole 9 yards, involved also with the ecological and the behavior elements of dogs, like how high do you urinate on a car tire? That's just, I think that's it's just so much fun. So yeah, I really can't wait to see how a lot of this stuff develops and what some of the key ways are, because if you can see this evolution happening in real time, then that is just a really great demonstration of the power of cities to think about larger and bigger questions within ecology, within evolution, within biology, and within this interaction, and the kind of accidental selection pressures that get put on place simply because we decide to light a street, and the knock-on effects of all of that with a huge range of different species as a result. Yeah, that's just super cool.
Yeah. I'm quite excited about it, and like this meeting had like allowed us to like come up with like some like basic data analytics, and it was fantastic to see that like these hypotheses are like there in place and it's working. It's just that I forgot to also share that there is possibility of experimentation as well, that we can put our own like lampposts, like take a large light and just put it on a telescopic, expecting a dog in high like vehicle congested area to take shelter underneath. So like
cool.
That would be like next leg.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think I have to think creative ways around testing this too, right? It's great. Excellent. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions. I think people are too blown away by the excitement of all of this stuff, which is perfectly acceptable for them. So, do you have any final words that you wanted to wrap up and maybe summarize it all and think about where we're going?
To sum up, I guess like we are like quite prepared to like deploy a lot of transmitters on dogs and macaques now, and the whole idea, which like Gregor just touched upon, was to understand how like the spatial extent of birds moving like thousands of kilometers to like queue upon something which is available on landfills of Delhi, and then comparing it with something like dogs or rats, which have like very like clear cognitive abilities to recognize within their home range itself of how humans are like perpetuating their systems with foraging opportunities. So I guess this like next leg of our research is going to be exciting. And over the next 1.5 to 2 years, we will also bring the demographic data into this account. We already have that for kites. And like we are into the position of using this information from camera trapping activities of about 150 kite nests from last 6 years to talk about the quantitative impacts of how it changes from the space. For instance, I can discuss that kites in the middle of the city, which can access to this like ritual meat tossing, for them it is about 95 to 100% of the diet coming from the ritual practice. But kites on the outskirts tend to, of course, like predate a lot. So they 70% of their diet comes out in predation. So if we can have like similar kind of understand similar kind of like patterns illustrated both for like dogs, because even people who are experts in dog behavior, they say that there are certain like ways where you can call them free ranging dogs, which essentially do not depend a lot on humans. They range through human areas, they pick up waste, but they do not interact with humans at all. Whereas they say there is something called strays, which are very human friendly and which have developed ways to read human gestures, and they are in the streets. So I guess these distinctions would be quite like evident when we put transmitters on like various animals and various individuals from multiple populations across the city. It will be fantastic to like over the next 5-10 years to take it to different cities in South Asia and probably Central Asia, some European or like African countries if possible. So on that bright note, I will like thank you, Marva, and like everybody who listened to us.